This is your World War III update. We have some very concerning developments with respect to the growing acrimony between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. As you know, by now, the timeline for the ultimatum has been accelerated. What was originally set to expire on September 3rd, which was a date that coincided, interestingly, with a meeting between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, one in which they were expected to ink a new strategic military partnership, which would likely see the endorsement for Russia's actions in Ukraine by the Chinese for the first time officially, notwithstanding all the other stuff that is going on in the South China Sea with respect to the mobilization of military force by the United States in and around Taiwan, and numerous other data points that all seem to signify a flashpoint of hostilities emerging in September. Well, now that timeline has been interestingly accelerated. Yesterday, we told you that it has been bumped up to 10 to 12 days. Trump has confirmed today in an interview that, in fact, if Russia does not relent in its attacks against Ukraine in the next 10 days, then there will be an imposition of tariffs, sanctions, and something else. Now, let's tease this apart. Tariffs against Russia are virtually meaningless because the U.S. and Russia don't really do much trade anymore. A little bit, but only the essential stuff. And they're working towards phasing that out. The tariffs generally apply to the Chinese, the BRICS nations, anybody who is buying Russian crude, now mostly on the black market. They would be tariffed across the board, generally 100%. That, of course, would cause a crash in the global markets. I can't see Trump really doing that. More importantly, people overlook this sanctions thing. The sanctions thing is important because if they were actually going to enforce it, then that would require an embargo of sorts. That embargo, should it take place in the Black Sea or the Baltic Sea, that has military repercussions. And that could be the casus belli Russia needs in order to do some sort of preemptive attack on NATO. If that's what Trump is talking about, not just another round of sanctions, but the actual manner in which the sanctions are enforced, that is significant. That could be the flashpoint that sets off a military kinetic engagement between East and West. However, I think the next two words that Trump stated are of greater significance. He said that within the next 10 days, if you do not relent in your attacks, tariffs, sanctions, and something else. What is this something else? Now, we know the Machiavellian stratagem typically employed by the West dictates that if they're saying 10 days, it very likely is going to be 8 days, or when this video is being released, for all we know. But they're very likely not going to be that transparent, especially if they're going to do something serious. Now, this something else, I presume, and many people are speculating, is going to be something in the form of more military support, more advanced offensive or defensive weaponry. Now, I've often stated, though, that defensive and offensive weaponry is a false dichotomy because a goalie is a member of the team all the same. Just as much, they're as essential as the guy who's shooting against the opposing side's net. And even if it is just the delivery of more Patriot systems and in an accelerated timeline, which is very concerning, and people should really focus on why is Trump suddenly gone from September 2nd to 10 days? Why would you rush something like that so quickly? What do they know that we don't? In light of the Starlink outage recently that, as predicted, they're chalking up to some sort of network update. Ooh, we give you faster speeds. Okay, sure. And the meeting today that we're going to talk about with the Roscosmos chief, the Russian space chief, arguably the most important guy in the Russian military orbit, is in the United States. Okay, you don't send an emissary like that to the United States, especially when the United States and the UK and the Ukrainian are trying to attack and kill all the Russian generals and high-ranking officials. Well, that's important because that smacks of nuclear deconfliction, okay? But with respect to this or else statement, Patriot defense systems and multi-layered air defense establishing green zones effectively that are impervious to anything but the Kinzhal hypersonics and maybe, the things that Russia doesn't have a lot of, like the Orezhniks. Well, that is going to be the umbrella in which NATO uses to send in troops. Because think about it, if NATO officially sends in troops and the families of said troops. They're not talking about sheep dip covert ops. They're talking about actual troops, and they immediately get destroyed by the Russians. Well, that's going to be a total PR disaster. So that's why you need to bring in air defense. This is why Russia is not dismissing the importance of Patriot batteries. This is why it was so important when they first delivered those Patriot systems in the first place, because it entailed a certain degree of interoperability with NATO and provides a shield for and a cover for the deployment of ground forces into Ukraine. All right. More importantly, on the offensive front, this could mean the delivery of longer-range weapon systems like the JASSM's air-to-surface missile systems for the F-16s or the Tomahawk missiles, which of course could be a delivery platform for nuclear weapons. A very serious escalation, if that in fact is the case. It could be a lot of things. It could just be the opening up of the ISR, of Starlink, to allow Ukraine to do more targeted strikes deeper inside Russia. It could be some planned decapitation strike. I mean, they're surrounding Russia all the way from the Arctic, Finland, Baltics, Poland, Romania, down to the Black Sea, Turkey. I mean, even in Kazakhstan now, the U.S. is striking a deal for rare earth materials, and there's a military defensive component to that as well that the Russians are not going to think too highly of, considering that that's where their biggest spaceport is located. Okay, so the Russians are being squeezed. The noose is tightening, and now we have 10 days, which really means we have less than 10 days. All right, and now you have the space chief of Roscosmos in the United States as we speak. So you have the Russian space chief flying there, while U.S. nuclear weapons are literally flying on planes to the UK. So that they have a formidable aviational component of their nuclear triad. And you have all this controversy with Zelensky. I tell you, something isn't right with this timeline. Why would they be rushing it so much? You know what I'm saying? Now, Trump struck a deal with the EU so that they're going to be buying all kinds of gas and oil. And that's really what this is about, the $750 billion, cutting Russia out of that market, nuking Nord Stream. Well, now it could entail the imposition of an actual embargo on Russian crude and their shadow fleet in the Baltic Sea, which most certainly would be a casus belli, and they could use the justification of Kaliningrad disrupting, using GPS interference and things of that nature, and acting as a potential problem for civilian vessels and military vessels alike in and around that region. That could be the U.S. justification for taking Kaliningrad, which of course they have threatened, and they have threatened to do it swiftly with the help of the Palantir Maven software. But I suspect that the excuse that they're using for the Russian Roscosmos chief, which is really, again, I must emphasize, probably the most important guy in terms of the Russian military orbit, okay? I mean, this is the guy that oversees the nuclear weapons delivery systems. He has gone to the United States. That level of diplomacy, of course, they're going to masquerade it as, yeah, we're talking about future cooperations and, the decommissioning of the space station and blah, blah, bullshit. You can do that shit over the phone. That's not what this is about. This is about nuclear deconfliction. This is very likely about the establishing of some red lines and getting prepared for what's about to happen next. We know that the Russians have now confirmed, and this is according to multiple sources, this is no longer speculation, they have delivered S-400 systems to Iran, and they are now going to be deploying those systems in combat. Okay, so that means that we could very well see, finally, F-35s and the most advanced 5th gen, possibly 6th gen fighter jets of the West go up against Russia's most lauded and formidable air defense platform. And this, of course, could entail all kinds of surprises. Okay, we're seeing drones go into NATO airspace more frequently. It's happened twice in the last month where a drone has crossed over either from Belarus or Russia itself into the Baltics. All kinds of intensification of hostilities along the Baltic front as well, and in and around Kaliningrad. So I suspect that these are some red lines and clarification of space-based weaponization. It probably has something to do with Starlink. It probably has something to do with the Golden Dome, and maybe even do with potential ASAT technology, anti-satellite technology, in the form of kinetic attacks, surface to space-based missiles like the S-500, or laser-based attacks, electronic warfare. This is what they're talking about. Okay, this is all about nuclear deconfliction, I suspect, which is a good thing that they're having that conversation. It is interesting considering that these are the types of people that the Ukrainians have been attempting to assassinate all this time. So the fact that they're there right now means that, this has to be very serious. And it's certainly not what they're making it out to be. Again, this could even be in pertaining to what's going on in Kazakhstan, where the U.S. just signed a deal today for the exploitation of Kazakhstan rare earth minerals that it, of course, needs one in many pieces of the thousands of pieces that are needed for its F-35s and other high-end military equipment. It needs these rare earth metals for that particular purpose, but there's a defensive component there as well. And so Russia, being very close with Kazakhstan, is going to have an issue with this. And this, of course, is where they have their largest spaceport located, where they could potentially even launch nuclear weapons from. So that is significant. And I would just say that it appears as though in the next 10 days, we're going to be turning a corner on this war some way or somehow. Hopefully it's for the better, but it very well could rapidly spiral out of control if, these points of communication are not generating any sort of positive results. And it doesn't appear so far that there is any positive result whatsoever. The bluster is getting more and more intense. Fortunately, up until this point, it's been just that, but that could materialize into some actual action that is deemed aggressive, and we could see a complete falling out of the bromance between Putin and Trump. It's still kind of dangling by threads, but it essentially has been kind of demystified at this point in time, I would say. Now, in terms of other news that is currently unfolding, as indicated recently, Zaluzhny is now appearing on a prominent UK magazine covers. I don't know the name of the magazine, but it is something that appeared very kind of out of character for him, being a military man. It appears to be trying to cast him in a more political light and try to distance him from his military past, knowing full well that the reason why he is going to be put into position is to manage military operations when the time comes, knowing that the military full well still respects him far more than they do Zelensky. They never respected Zelensky even before the war, especially the Azov battalion and people who are adjacent to that sort of ideological thought. They never really respected Zelensky for obvious reasons, perhaps related to his origin and ethnicity. But it appears as though his walking papers, as Seymour Hersh has indicated, he's not long for this world, at least with respect to Ukraine, that is. France has suffered a catastrophic defense leak, 13 gigabytes of naval group data, including nuclear sub-combat software. This was likely a massive vulnerability to Russian or Chinese exploitation, and there was no ransom demanded, which means that this was likely a nation state who did this. This was a message being sent, of course, France. When it comes to UK or France or the 100-odd tactical nuclear weapons that are peppered throughout NATO by the United States, France has the most formidable nuclear forces. So this could potentially have been a very big blow in terms of enabling the Russians and the Chinese to have some pretty important information that could potentially compromise any sort of nuclear exchange in our direction. As I indicated, Iran is testing the Russian S-400 under real conditions near the Isfahan nuclear facility. The system includes 48 N-6E3 and possibly 40 N-6 missiles up to 380-kilometer range. This signals Iran's readiness to shoot down F-35 jets and alters Israel's nuclear calculus. Of course, there's lots of rumblings. Things are quite quiet on that front, but it appears as though Israel is getting ready to make a move in Lebanon, and there are rumors that Iran has actually decided to come to the aid of Lebanon, unlike in recent times, if they get attacked. And they could be emboldened by this delivery of the S-400 systems, but the jury is still out on what Russia will permit them to use it for. Is it just for certain reasons, as it was in Syria, which it never got used for? I would presume that in Syria, Russia was able to collect a lot of data on the U.S. Advanced weapon systems and have likely been able to tune those radars and those systems to these fifth-generation fighter jets. I'm not an expert, but I just presume, seeing them fly around all over the place all the time, they would have collected a lot of useful information about those particular things. North Korea has declared denuclearization talks as dead. Well, isn't that interesting, considering that Trump was the first person to go and shake Kim Jong-un's hand? Well, I want you to play that tape forward, okay? I want you to think about if Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin shake hands, and if this is the outcome 10 years from today, when you had Kim Jong-un at that time appear to be turning a corner in U.S. relations, only to that following month initiate a string of missile tests which dwarfed any preceding year on record in 2017, 2018. Well, now, while Trump is in office for a second term, it appears as though relations have completely soured, and North Korea is demanding that they acknowledge them as a nuclear power, which of course is never going to happen. And this at the same time when North Koreans are fighting in Eastern Europe and preparing to enter into the fight in Ukraine and sharing a nuclear pact with the Russians. Okay, so now if you attack North Korea, you got to go up against Russia's nukes, which is crazy to think about, that we've come that far, that it's been normalized. There was a time, if you recall, that any suggestion that the North Koreans were helping Russia at all, I mean, this is way before artillery shell deliveries, that was seen as big news, right? That was like World War III headlines. And here we are today. They have a nuclear pact. They're sending 30,000 troops to the front. And North Korea just told Donald Trump to go fuck himself. I mean, if that doesn't sound the alarm on things, then I don't know what will. German Eurofighters, all 5 of them, I think, it's kind of a joke, but regardless, it's a step in the wrong direction, arrive in Romania to begin NATO air policing. Romanian F-16s deployed to the Baltics and Bulgaria. Also, Eastern NATO airspace now under continuous rotation, reflecting high alert status. And don't think for a second that the F-16s being flown by the Ukrainians aren't just coming across the border from Romania and Poland and being flown by NATO pilots. I mean, it's just mission creep, right? So I've been saying that since day one. I told you I was the first one to talk about this, and then it came out, it was made official, that in fact there were NATO pilots piloting these things. I told you that it was these F-16s would not be flown by Ukrainians, and that once you put one in there, you're never going to know. You could just keep replacing it. It doesn't really matter the number that they say are there, because NATO has all these F-16s on their borders, and they're kind of interchangeable. You just change the decals, and there you go. If you can even see them in the sky. All Russia is going to see is maybe a radar signature, right? So they're never going to know. And this is very problematic because these are nuclear delivery platforms. Anyways, we're seeing mobilization across the front, but, you know, nobody cares, right? Because it's just the times that we're living in. People are so desensitized to this stuff, but it's going to make a whole lot of sense when it does finally hit the fan. Lithuania is fortifying their air defenses on the Belarusian border after the second Russian drone incursion. This month, a full drone detection network is being deployed across the entire border. A military drone with explosive payload and Ukrainian markings crashed in Belarus. Now, Ukraine has refrained from targeting Belarus specifically, which is surprising considering Belarusian involvement in this conflict, going so far to act as a staging ground for Russia to launch the war against Ukraine in the first place. There have been a few attacks, but nothing significant. So we could very well see NATO start to attack Belarus in that direction. As I indicated, the EU is going to be buying $750 billion worth of U.S. energy and weapons, replacing Russian supply lines completely. Of course, this is a resource war, and the only way the United States has a hope in hell of getting out of debt is if they cut the Russians out of the market entirely and, in fact, try to acquire Russian resources by balkanizing it, installing some sort of puppet government, and taking over all of the resource wealth of that country. The strategic alignment with the United States is deepening, and essentially you're having all of these bridges burned because now that you have this agreement with Trump, well, that guarantees that Europe can never make peace with Russia, you see? So it's just this self-perpetuating cycle. Germany is developing long-range strike drones via consortia with a variety of different German companies in order to bypass Russian air defense. Again, it's all recon by fire. They're testing the fences for the big grand finale decapitation strike attempt that will be coordinated at high level by artificial intelligence and all of NATO's assets that are forward deployed in the region. Poland once again reiterated their urge to citizens to leave Russia. Ukraine begins conscripting men over 60 due to drastic manpower shortages and due to severe attrition. And Kaliningrad pretext appears to be brewing. We have potential GPS jamming incidents as a legal cover for intervention. Some people are saying that EU military logistics are failing and that roads and bridges cannot support tank movement eastward, which I find interesting that they're really giving serious thought to fighting a conventional war with the Russians. That just seems absurd that the Russians would even entertain such a notion, because it would be a losing battle. You know, it's one thing to fight Europe, it's another thing to fight Germany, it's another thing to fight Europe, it's another thing to fight Europe and the United States. It's just something they can't do unless they have the full support of the Chinese in every possible way. Then it's possible to fight a conventional war. Anyways, Europe is upgrading their roads and their bridges in order to accommodate the movement of large amounts of military equipment across mainland Europe to the front lines. So if anybody thinks that this is, it's just going to be a flash in the pan, World War III hysteria, this is a world war, and it is going to materialize as such, and you should hope. The only thing we can hope for is a swift victory, in the words of Palantir, winning wars before they happen, in the form of some sort of asymmetrical decapitation strike that minimizes the potential use of nuclear weapons and tries to tackle this problem in a way that doesn't escalate up the use of unconventional weaponry. Guys, that's pretty much all I have for you today. Go check out the Canadian Prepper YouTube channel. We've been releasing a lot of practical content for those of you who like that sort of stuff. And as much as I'm throwing shade yesterday in my video on a lot of, I like to call them prepping pragmatists who do this moral grandstanding thing where they talk about how you shouldn't prepare for SHTF because it's impractical. I've covered pretty much every possible concept on the channel, from EDC to evacuation, preparing for the 95% likelihood stuff to the 5% likelihood stuff. The problem with a lot of that content, I find it's just so basic and vacuous. Like, it's stuff that you can read on the back of a cereal box, man. I mean, we're living in the age of AI. AI can tell you all of that stuff. So really, our only role, once the smoke clears on all that nonsense, our only real role as content creators moving forward is really not going to be to educate. It's going to be to share our opinions and speculations about things, because you can get the news delivered in a more condensed format faster elsewhere. People want rage bait. They want drama, right? And unfortunately, that's the only way to communicate with people nowadays, in a way that proves that it's a human talking to you, right? So I do the generic boilerplate prepping stuff just because I still am of the ethos that the only way we're going to get more people prepared is if you speak to them at that level. And it's remembering that there still is a significant portion of the population that is at the level where they don't even know what a bug out bag is. I get that. But at the same time, it's kind of demoralizing knowing full well that you're only ever, no matter what you do, you're only ever going to reach an incredibly small portion of people, no matter what method you try to employ. And throwing each other under the bus as preppers is not the way to go. You know, I mean, let's stop pretending that we're preparing for a 3-day, 7-day emergency. Look, I understand the importance of evacuating from natural disasters. That's a big part of preparedness, but that's easy, really. You know, it is easy. You know, you make sure you get your bug out vehicle on check. You have your checklist. You have, you know, an evacuation plan. We've talked about all those things. The hard part is preparing for a protracted Mad Max style event, which I think is increasingly more likely. And the powerful and influential and wealthy people in this world, I can assure you, think the same way that I do. And the only thing is they don't have an interest in talking about it in the way I do with a YouTube channel and all these things. So in fact, they have an interest in keeping their mouth shut about their preparedness endeavors, unless your name is Mark Zuckerberg and you foolishly make it public. However, I do think there's been more news about Mark Zuckerberg. I do think that it's a decoy. I think this guy is rich enough that he could have 10 decoys. Okay, this whole Kauai thing in Hawaii, you know, I think that that's a decoy. I think his real bug out location is probably somewhere else, if I'm being brutally honest. And I think that it's actually an interesting strategy, because that's going to be where people think he is. And a guy who's that smart, he's got to be thinking several more steps ahead. And if he's not, then AI is really, you know, we're not too far from AGI, if that's the case. If the smartest people aren't even smart enough to figure that out, then holy shit. Anyways, guys, I got to go.